So, tonight we have Ed Lopez, Professor of Economics, BB&T Distinguished Professor of Capitalism and Director of the Center of the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University, where he teaches principles, applied business economics, public finance, the moral foundations of capitalism. We were just talking about exchanging syllabi, because as you know, I teach the same class here. He was previously a professor at San Jose State University, where he was a colleague of our very own.
We weren't there at the same time.
Oh,
We're in the same family.
Okay. But they were both at San Jose State. He was also the director and past president of the Public Choice Society, which is a very prestigious economics organization. He was also the past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, API, where some of us are going this year. It's going to be in the Bahamas. And he is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise that I mentioned a minute ago. He has an extensive record of publications and books. He just asked me not to go over all of that, so I'm gonna, but please help me welcome Professor Ed Lopez.
Hi, so all that makes me, I think the bottom line is, it just says, Professor Lopez is getting old. He's done all these, well, thanks for coming out. It's great to see you tonight. I want to start off by asking if you've heard about, with this here, heard about the 2018 midterms. $5.7 billion were spent on those elections. And as this report goes on to show, that's the largest amount spent on an election in U.S. history, at least since we've been really tracking these, and arguably, even before that. And it's more than any previous general election year, and it's going to be the highest that we've had so far. So, I don't know, I think one way to think about what we're here to talk about tonight, what I'd like to talk with you about tonight is $5.7 billion, a lot of money. A lot of money on 435 seats, right? Not all of those have elections on them at the same time. But do you have $5.7 billion? I don't have $5.7 billion. If I did, I'd buy a beach house with it or something. Yeah. But so I think from that perspective, it seems like a lot. And like the report says, it's more than what has happened in previous elections. And so I think, well, yeah, it might sound like a lot of that perspective. But then, I wonder if you want to put it in another perspective and say, well, is it a lot compared to what? And you might think, well, say, if this is the amount that we're spending to elect people to federal office, what about if we say, how much is this relative to what they do once they're elected to federal office? Or maybe like if we wanted to measure it, we could put it up to, compared to the dollar amount of the size of the federal government. Right? And so once you think about it from that perspective, is it a lot that we spend electing federal officials compared to what federal officials spend every year? Turns out the federal budget's over $2 trillion. $2 trillion, 5.87 billion is not a large amount compared to $2+ trillion. So that's another way to look at it. And I think that's kind of the nature, that's kind of the spirit, that's kind of the direction that my talk is going to take. And recognizing that 5.7 billion is more than what we've been spending recently, it's definitely an increase, and it's probably a trend for more increases. But that maybe on the contrarian side of this, there's a basis for saying, why is it so small? Why isn't it much, much, much bigger? Say, to reflect the size of the federal government. Why isn't that we spend only, a tiny fraction of that to elect them? Why so small? So, one way to get things going is to sort of point out, make explicit that the worry about money in politics is that it will begin to make undue or undemocratic influence on policy. So the money can go against what people want, and that's undemocratic. There's also issues of, well, we have a lot of rules and regulations on the books that aren't being followed, and this is creating loopholes to tilt the balance towards some people, some candidates compared to others. And, just there's way too much of it. There's plenty too much of it. And so there are books and literature like this one by Lawrence Lessig that argue this is corrupting to the American democratic system. And it might not be corrupting in a sense that we're bribing congressmen to do certain things these days. Not that venal type of corruption, but the type of corruption that erodes basically their ability to do their elected functions. And the more they have to spend fundraising and chasing dollars to get reelected, the less they can do, the functions that were designed for that office. So that's the argument from the corruption side of things. What should we do about it? Well, there are a pretty steady beat of suggestions for this. Basically, these suggestions amount to try to stop money in politics. So put bans and limits and caps on spending. Put those also on contributions from donors to elections. And maybe, do other types of reforms such as public, taxpayer-funded elections, something like that. And here's a bunch of legislation that does that ever since the modern era of the 1970s. So there's also since we've been really tracking the dollars. There's major legislation here, and the general flavor of it is these sort of bans, caps, and limits on activity. They want to make sure that it doesn't get too big. They want to try to stop the influence of money. They want to try to stem the flow of it. Now, of course, a lot of this gets litigated so that the actual law is not what Congress wrote, but what courts ruled upon. And the courts in this issue have two main, main trade-off between two main factors. The first factor being our laws need to be written in a way to protect against corruption or the appearance of corruption in government. And on the other hand, our laws need to reflect protections, constitutional protections such as free speech. And so the courts are treating political expression, spending on campaigns, spending to elect people, every one of those $5.7 billion, that's protected speech. And so this is the main trade-off. It's like these laws that came on the previous slide. To what extent do they infringe on people's speech? And the court will say you can't do that, and the law will have to change in reflection. And that's what's happened over the course of these cases. To the point now where, the Citizens United case says that independent spending outside of campaigns cannot be limited. And this McCutcheon case says donations to independent organizations also, there are no limits on those. So the floodgates have opened. And what do people think about it? Some people think, well, that's crazy. Democracy's not for sale. We don't want our money corrupting our politics. We want people voting, not donating, voters, not donors. And so demonstrations like this reflect what some people think. Gallup did a poll of what maybe average people think. And it turns out that average people, according to this poll, think of campaign spending as free speech, 57%. They also asked, do the current rules that treat corporations, unions, and individuals the same work, or should different rules apply? And 55% said they work. That's, by the way, 10 years ago now. 2009 is when this Citizens United case was bubbling up a lot. So it was a really long time ago. And I wonder if they took this poll today, how the results were different. So right now, that's kind of the setup of what the issue is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on these organizations to track the money. And I'm going to say, how could we look at this issue, from and these concerns about it, using some of the data in an interesting way. So here's what these collectors of the data, you pull their data, and this is what it is. If you look at total spending on congressional campaigns, back in the late 70s, you know, it's a couple of hundred billion. And it grows in the 90s. It starts to grow at rates that exceed, far exceed the rate of inflation, far exceed GDP growth, even approach college tuition increase rates. Starts to grow really fast. And now we're about up here at about $2.5 billion. So this, by the way, says this says 5.7 billion, and that was the 2018 election, right? So what's up with this one is this also why is this only saying 2.5 billion, not 5.7? And that's because, just to kind of think about how this information gets sliced up. They're spending by the campaigns themselves, and then they're spending by non-campaign groups. And I'm only showing here the campaigns themselves. Right? So that's like Congress's portion, the Congress campaign portion of the 5.7 billion. So they're going to match up here. You'll see in just a moment. Total spending by presidential campaigns has this sort of similar, right in the mid 90s and forward is growing by extremely high rates. This is all spending. This is all spending on all the elections by the campaigns and by the outside groups as well. And so over here in 2016, you see it reaches over here. That's It's $5 billion. So the 2018 column right next to it would be up here at 5.7 billion. Right? So that's how that number would fit in. It counts the money that the campaigns are spending themselves. It counts the money of non-campaign folks as well. Those primarily are the parties and then the super PACs or the electioneering organizations. Okay, so it looks to be pretty big. It's been growing a lot. Spending on elections is up sharply in recent years. Polls indicate that elected officials' time fundraising is up sharply, away from doing public service and away from doing their constituent service. So these guys, maybe they have a point. That's good. Let's see what maybe we might, another way we might look at it is in a sort of magnitude question in a relative sense. Is it big in a relative sense? Well, I think there's something to looking at campaign spending and saying, well, that's like advertising for the public sector. And I wonder if we were to begin looking at, if we think of election spending as campaigns, as advertising in the public sector, how might it compare to advertising in the private sector? And so I went and hunted down from a yearly basis for the entire U.S. economy how much is spent on advertising. Right? Now look at this axis here. There's more zeros. Right? It's a bigger number. It's bigger by order of magnitude, the amount of private sector advertising compared to campaign spending. Okay? So that's one way to sort of think about this magnitude question in relative terms. But we can go a little bit deeper. We can get a little bit more specific here. Think about a ratio of ratios. All right? Let's work through this example here. The first ratio we're going to say is total private sector advertising, what I just showed you on the previous slide, that bigger number, divided by the total size of the private sector. And here what I'm just going to say is how much of GDP minus the government sector is there. And we'll use that as our measure of the private sector. And so in the year 1999-2000, for that election cycle, we had about 4.7 billion in total campaign spending. And total. We had 470 billion of total private sector advertising, and we had about a private sector of about 8 trillion, and that works out to about 5.8 cents on the dollar in the private sector go to advertising. Right, 5.8%. Think about what this looks like for the public sector, for the election spending example. Ratio number 2 is going to be total federal campaign spending divided by total size of the public sector, total size of the federal government, right? And so here, you can take the amount, you can look at the budget, you can measure the amount of goods and services that are produced, and you can get to a total size of the federal budget. And in 1999-2000, in this cycle, we're looking at numbers of 1.85 billion spent on the elections, divided by 1789 billion total size of the public sector, and here's our 0.001 number. So whereas in the private sector, 5.8 cents are spent advertising for every dollar, here it's about a 1/10 of a cent for every in the public sector. So that works out to the size of advertising in the private sector as a percentage of the size of the private sector is 56 and some change times bigger. Right, so just looking at it in this relative term is a way to think about maybe the word small here is in place. So if you do that ratio not just for the 99-2000 cycle, where it's about 56, right over here is about 56, but for all the election cycles, what you see is that it ranges from, it's been on the decline a little bit. So the public sector, so advertising in elections is growing relative to advertising in private sector. But it's still above 40, and for the whole thing, the range is about from 40 to 70 times as big. Right? So, one question could be, I think the question that I want to sort of begin to get at is, why is this so small? If it is small, why is it, what might be some reasons for that? Okay. One reason might be that, no, this whole exercise doesn't hold up. Why? And, that's fine. I'm open to that possibility. Maybe this 2 ratios approach is flawed, right? And I think there you'd want to get into, is it really a good comparison to take, total advertising in the private sector and look at, compare that to spending on elections? What do you really get out of that comparison? And, maybe you get something that supports the exercise that I showed, or maybe it's something different, and that's fine. Maybe it's bigger than what this exercise has shown. There's also this question of what are we measuring? And we're not, we want to measure one thing, but the data is there to only capture part of it. That's another possibility. So, you ever see an image like this? What do we have here? It's a street lamp, right? And there's not, there's right around the area it's well lit, but beyond there it's not, right? And what's this related to? It's the street lamp fallacy, right? And the idea of the street lamp fallacy is if you have lost your keys, you know you lost your keys in the park across the street, but you come over here and look under the lamp because that's where the light is good. Right? That's the fallacy of thinking there. And that applies in a way to how we're measuring campaign dollars. We require folks like campaigns and interest groups and political parties and super PACs to fill out forms, and individuals, right? We require them to fill out forms, and that's where we get these numbers from, these dollars of spending. But those forms don't capture all of the attempts to influence policy. There are attempts to influence policy outside your political donations. So, for example, they don't measure, when you're talking about a big-time lobbyist, those disclosure forms don't capture the real estate that they have to rent on K Street to be close to Congress and in the lobbying scene, right? They don't measure the opportunity costs of taking capital out of the firm and putting the capital into the government relations side. And so maybe there's a lot of rent seeking that gets done, investment by people into their relationships in the federal government for the purpose of influencing policy instead of investing that capital elsewhere, that's what we mean by rent seeking. And what we might be worried about here with this measurement error is value that's invested by the lobbyist but doesn't get received by the policymaker. It sort of falls in the cracks, and that's a form of rent-seeking waste. The word for that's dissipation. Right? So we're worried about these issues because of Gordon Tullock. Gordon Tullock wrote this important series of papers beginning in 1967 on what is rent-seeking, and he says, and the ensuing literature says it's more than what we're measuring with campaign finance dollars. So there definitely is some measurement error going on. One other reason besides it's actually not small is that, well, maybe the contributors want it that way. The folks who are making the donations to the campaigns, maybe they want it that way. Maybe they don't want to give any more, even though they can effectively legally do so. And there's a couple reasons why that might be the case. One reason is that it's really hard to pin down evidence that, it's really hard to pin down evidence that, like when you run regressions, to relate contributions to a campaign and then how that member votes once they're in office. It's hard to establish that correlation. There are some exceptions. The closer the donation to the timing of the vote seems to matter. How narrowly the vote is construed, like is it on a particular industry or is it an omnibus bill, that seems to matter too. But for the most part, it's hard to, that evidence is elusive to tie contributions to votes. There doesn't seem to be a systematic market here of a quid pro quo. And so maybe if, as a result of that, I'll skip over this part, it says the same thing. People, they don't want to invest a lot because they can't buy votes. And then there's also these other possibilities here that, I don't want to have an ongoing commitment of having to make a donation every cycle. There's maybe a low return on these things. And besides, I'd rather keep a low profile because sometimes companies get into stigma problems from having, going public that, they were politically active. Right? So prefer low profile. Maybe all these reasons add up to, contributors maybe wanting it to be that way. Right? So that's one other possibility. Could hold up. It might account for part of, the question. Right? Why is it bigger? Another thing is like maybe voters are getting what they want. If you think about how do voters come into play here? Well, we elect people to sort of make policy for the country. And one of the policies they make is campaign finance reform, or campaign finance laws. So maybe they're doing a good job of it. And voters don't want a lot of money for politics. They understand maybe that it's a part of the game. They understand maybe that, like water running downhill, it's not going to be easy to stop it. And, like they elect people who go up there and take care of it for the most part. Right? So, maybe their existing restrictions are targeting what voters want. And voters don't want a bigger number, so that's why we don't have a bigger number. So maybe that contributes a little bit to the question too. And then another aspect is maybe the politicians want it that way. Maybe the politicians don't want it to be a bigger number. Maybe what could be a couple of possibilities or reasons why there. They might have an image or a perception problem. They'd rather not spend all this time fundraising, and also it might help their re-election chances. They might have an incumbent advantage out of having this dollar amount so small. So think about how this might work. An incumbent compared to a challenger. Somebody who's been in office compared to somebody who wants to win the election to take that office. An incumbent has been in office for a while. Maybe it's several terms. Maybe even it's their first term. But the whole time they're in office, their name is out there, and they are making communications to their voters. They're sending, letters and emails, and they're getting on TV when they can. They're on C-SPAN talking on the floor. They're visible, and their name is out there. And in terms of, their stature, their station in the voter's mind, there's a visibility factor there. Well, that's not true if you're the challenger. That's not true if you don't have as much recognition, you don't have as much visibility in the mind of the voter. You're starting from a sort of lower level of recognition, of brand name recognition almost, right? So just like brand name can be thought of as part of the company's working capital, right? You want to invest in goodwill as a company. You want to do that also as an elected official, as a politician. And so you invest in this capital. You invest in building up this reputation. And sometimes you need to make a maneuver for legislation, and you need to spend down some of this capital, right? But you don't build it up for nothing. You want to use it. You want to utilize your political capital. But in order to do that, you got to invest and maintain it too. So think about how that differs for incumbents compared to for challengers. Somebody who's been in office for a while and is at this level already, compared to somebody who's new and needs to rise up from a lower level. And when you think of that through, you might say, well, for how much? Take a chart here and say for how much campaign spending you have. For increases in campaign spending on the right, how much does that increase your electoral capital? Right? By how much does it raise you to the next level? And I think that for incumbents, there's a point of diminishing returns where they already have sufficient brand name recognition that another dollar spent doesn't add much to that brand name recognition. And maybe if they get overexposed and they start spending much, actually the effect becomes negative. Right? And so maybe there's a point of diminishing and eventually maybe negative returns on that. Well, that's what the incumbents would look like. There's no reason to think that the challengers would look any different. They might reach a point of diminishing returns, and then if they get overexposed, they might have sort of declining returns from there. But maybe maybe the point of diminishing returns is at a higher amount of spending. That's the argument for how restrictions on campaign finance are actually tilting the playing field towards incumbents, limiting the amount that can be spent on politics, on elections, favors those who are already in office, because they reach a point of diminishing returns at a lower amount of spending than the challengers do.
So just to clarify on the vertical axis, electoral capital, in the sense of the stock, as opposed to flow?
Right, I think that, well, no, I think it's the marginal impact of another dollar on, on your spending, right? So, but definitely you build up a stock of, in this analogy, a politician would build up a stock of capital and want to maintain that. Sometimes you'll see incumbents run in unopposed elections. There's nobody on the ballot opposite them. But they still run ads and they still spend on their election campaign. And that's because they're investing in this stock of capital. Okay? And then later on, when they might need to spend down that capital if they want to go against what the party wants them to do, or if they make a deal with another member of Congress that makes them look like they're voting against what their constituents want, maybe they spend down some of that capital on opportunities like that. But kind of within that framework is this incumbent advantage point, right? And the basic point of it again is it works for incumbents to have lower amounts of spending, because that doesn't let the challengers get out to increasing returns. And so here, what you can see is that there seems to be a pretty big incumbent advantage over history. So starting in 1900, every 2 years forward to 2016, we have a percent of those members of Congress who are seeking re-election who win the re-election. And so for the most part, if you look over here at 2016, this is the last election I have here, we're above 95%. 95% and some change, 96.7% in the 2016 election. Of those members of Congress who are seeking re-election, 96, 97% of those won it. And that's what this number is for all the years back. Okay. So I think there's a couple of interesting things here. Anybody spot a year and a level where they think it makes a lot of sense? So, 32, yeah. That's the lowest one right here, less than 70%. And what's the shock that's occurring at that time? The Great Depression, and that that influenced the change in regime coming into the New Deal. What else? Any other year? So 32 was the lowest. There's a few years that are kind of tied to the highest, right? Somewhat in the last 20 years are at 97%. So I think that's where it has capped out, at 97. What about 2008? Yeah, and 2010. Yeah, 2010 I should say, not 2010. So that's Great Recession. And there was a hit to the re-election rate went to 85%. Right? So there seems to be a pretty good incumbent advantage here. And you would think that this plays at least a small part in it, maybe less than a small part, or maybe more than a small part. But one thing that I want to notice is that here's where right here on 74 is where the sort of modern campaign finance era begins. This is when the data that I showed you all goes back to 74. This is when the Federal Election Commission Act was passed in 74. So 74 and forward, it's not like the re-election rate has gone down. I think the regression line would look pretty flat, actually, around 90%. So, and that's in the era where Congress has enacted, numerous restrictions on campaign finance, and then courts have undone it. Right? So, really, that's kind of what I wanted to bring to attention, and maybe think about, hey, does this hold up? Does this give me a new way to think about what happens? Politics can feel so far away, so far off, and happening, independent of what you do. But when you start to think about it, I mean, does this comparison improve that? Do you see any problems with it? Any kind of questions will do, and I hope we have a good discussion. Thanks for having me.